Ladies and gentlemen, we'll kick off because we do have a set time that we need to link to Brussels a little bit later to Denny Rednay, the DG of the Trade Directorate in Brussels. We're going to hear first from Mathias Cormann. Now, I realise this is the last session of the day, but we've set ourselves a pretty big task, which is to rescue the rules-based trading order. So it's worth your attention. Please coffee up. You're allowed to have a coffee after 3 o'clock at this conference. But look, as I said, as Mike flagged, our keynote is Mathias Cormann. He would have loved to come back to Australia. He's obviously a very well-known figure here as Australia's longest-serving finance minister, former leader of the House in the Senate, and a senator from Western Australia. Unfortunately, Mathias has had to travel to Lithuania for an anti-corruption meeting, so he ended up cutting a video about literally 12 hours ago, and we'll be watching the video from Mathias, but it's very recent. He'll be talking about, obviously, that the role of the OECD in preserving and working really as a partner with liberal democracies on this new era of economic statecraft. But if our people in the AV section could help us play the video from Mathias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all, thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this discussion on the rules-based international order and where it is headed, or where it should be headed. For many decades post the Second World War, our rules-based international order has served as well as a solid foundation for stability, development, growth, and increases in incomes and living standards around the world. However, today the rules-based order is under significant pressure. Pressures on trading patterns and risk of economic fragmentation as a result of geopolitical tensions and strategic competition have been developing for some time. The pandemic further accentuated some of those pressures, and we have now a major war in Europe, which is into its third year. There are the evolving conflicts in the Middle East, new strains of protectionism. There are growing concerns about economic coercion, security of supply, and market concentration, including and in particular in the context of a significantly growing demand for a range of key products required to support the green and digital transformations of our economies and societies around the world. Despite the overall very challenging context, the global economy, though, has shown remarkable resilience. Global growth is set to continue, even if it is at a more modest pace compared to historical standards. Emerging Asia, that is China, India, Indonesia, and dynamic Asian economies continue to account for more than half of all global growth. Global trade, albeit still weak, comparatively speaking, is showing signs of improvements, and headline and core inflation have continued to decline in countries around the world, whereas global financial conditions have begun to ease. But despite these positive signs, we cannot be complacent. We need to rebuild trust and confidence in the global trading system. We must restore the negotiation, rulemaking, and adjudication functions of the WTO. And we must resist the fragmentation of the global economy into blocks. There is much we must do, and indeed there is much we can do. And I guess what I'm going to address in my remarks today is how the OECD can assist and what role the OECD can play. We need to make the right policy choices to improve medium to long-term growth prospects while addressing our shared global challenges. There is the need to boost stagnant productivity growth, including by tackling counterproductive barriers which are holding back global trade and investment flows and further innovation. There is a need to tackle climate change in a way that is globally effective and fair. The need for a policy approach to the digital transformation and AI, which ensures the broad diffusion of its benefits and facilitates further innovation, while also providing for the appropriate mitigation and management of evolving risks and disruptions. There's a need to respond to the economic, fiscal and social impacts of population ageing and a whole range of other significant policy challenges. Well-functioning global markets, a global level playing field and a rules-based trading system in good working order are a key foundation to help us manage all of those challenges. Our latest economic outlook released on the 2nd of May shows how trade growth is recovering gradually. Global trade rose in the fourth quarter of last year as a result of strong growth in China, Korea and the United States. And recent high-frequency indicators on merchandise trade and export orders suggest that the recovery of trade is continuing into this year. But looking ahead, the case for continuing trade liberalisation is no longer being made, certainly not strongly and persuasively enough. In fact, there are increasing voices in the other direction. And that is even though trade liberalisation has delivered sustained increases in incomes and living standards around the world, including in Australia, where from 1986 to 2016 it is estimated that global trade has contributed to permanent increases in GDP of at least 5.4% and increases in real wages, that is adjusted for inflation, by at least 7.4%. Current increases in trade restricting measures around the world will have a negative impact on business activity, on growth, and on income convergence, and it will also increase the costs of the green transition. Last year, 11.8% of the value of G20 imports were affected by import restrictions implemented since 2009, and the trend is not our friend on this particular trajectory. We need to reinvigorate trade liberalisation efforts around the world. Globalisation, open markets, freer global trade and investment flows, the expansion of global trade have very significantly contributed to increased incomes and living standards around the world, helping to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Globalisation and open markets demonstrably drive growth. They promote competition, innovation, productivity growth, and efficiency. More trade and more investment means stronger growth, more jobs, higher incomes, and lower costs for consumers and business. Deglobalisation, decoupling, or economic fragmentation would make us all poorer. It would mean lower growth, fewer jobs, lower incomes, and higher costs for consumers and business. It will mean that we will end up selling fewer goods and services into the global market and be forced to pay more for the goods and services we buy. It would also cause further supply chain disruptions, leading to overall reductions in economic efficiency. Yes, we need to make globalization work better for people. We need to ensure we have, to the greatest extent possible, a fair global level playing field for trade with well-functioning global markets based on a rules-based global trading system in good working order. We need to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in and benefit from the upside of expanding global trade, and that the environmental and social implications, and indeed all the risks, are better managed. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's improve the way globalization works for people. Let's not try and stop or reverse it. There is, of course, nothing wrong with de-risking. Any business facing risks will assess its risk and develop strategies to better manage those risks, to mitigate those risks and to better manage those risks. Excessive concentration of production and supply bases, or the customer base for that matter, of course, increases risk. So it is entirely appropriate in the context of some of the supply chain disruptions experienced in the wake of COVID and more recently in the wake of the impact of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, that there will be an assessment of those risks and an attempt to seek to address them, to mitigate and better manage some of those risks. But let's do so in a sensible and balanced way and without unnecessarily putting at risk the upside benefits that come with expanding global trade. Helping policymakers to manage these pressures and to get that balance right is a key priority for the OECD. Supporting open trade on a level playing field is a part of our DNA as an organisation. Our predecessor organization, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which was established in the aftermath of the Second World War back in 1948, was established, in fact, with a mandate that included lifting trade barriers across Europe. The organization helped form a new rules-based international order grounded in its members' shared commitment to the preservation of individual liberty, democracy, the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and market-based economic principles, which are values that have stood the test of time. And on the strong foundation of those shared values and principles, and on the basis of the data and the evidence that we collect and we disseminate, our job here at the OECD is to help governments around the world develop and implement better policies for better lives. In relation to trade, that means, for example, through our unique databases to provide governments and researchers with granular product-level trade data to assess concentration in supply chains and to address the identified risks accordingly. Earlier this year, we published new analysis using this data to identify 50 products that are highly vulnerable to shocks due to limited suppliers and substitutability, ranging from the pharmaceutical sector, for instance, in relation to certain types of antibiotics, to manufacturing, where, of course, semiconductor concentration is a key concern, to mining outputs. And we've also analyzed production concentration in the raw material and manufacturing supply chains that are critical for the green transition. Production of these minerals remains highly concentrated, for example, with China producing 87% of magnesium, 62% of graphite, and 60% of rare earth. Upstream, China accounts for 80% of the world's solar panel manufacturing and 70% of cobalt processing. The OECD remains committed to encouraging further progress on trade liberalisation, supporting a more level playing field, generating new opportunities and helping to mitigate the risks of concentration. An open, well-functioning global market on the strong foundation of rules-based global trade is indeed a key building block of improved economic security. We can manage potential risks and disruptions in concentrated supply chains without decoupling, without undermining trade as the foundation of our shared priority. There are a range of things we need to do, which the OECD is supporting. First, we continue to strengthen the global rules-based order through the development, promotion and implementation of OECD standards and best practices across a broad range of policy areas. This important area of work is focused on facilitating economic cooperation and ensuring fair competition. The OECD has a comprehensive global relations strategy to promote the adoption of OECD standards and best practices globally, for example, in relation to international taxation. Accession to the OECD is the most direct way to achieve adherence to OECD standards and best practices. There continues to be strong interest from key countries around the world to join the OECD and hence to commit themselves to alignment with the OECD's standards and best practices. Earlier this year, the OECD Council made the historic decision to commence accession discussions with Indonesia. And hot off the press, earlier this week, our Council has also just made the decision to commence accession discussions with Thailand. This means that the biggest and second biggest economies in Southeast Asia, the most dynamic growth region of the world, are now engaged in a process of alignment with OECD standards and best practices as a means to anchor their reform agenda towards becoming advanced economies. Indonesia and Thailand are joining Argentina, Brazil and Peru from Latin America, and Bulgaria, Croatia and Romania as EU countries, as current accession candidate countries. Indonesia and Thailand are engaged in this process, and being engaged in this process will have a beneficial impact on the rules-based order across their region and beyond. And this is also important for trade liberalisation efforts. For example, our Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, which helps to identify opportunities to further services trade liberalisation for some of Australia's key trading partners, including Indonesia and Thailand, which at this point remain much more restrictive than the OECD average. Second, helping build capacity to identify and anticipate risks. Our Keys to Resilient Supply Chains policy toolkit provides practical advice to policymakers on risk assessments, as well as managing those risks. One critical element is close coordination between governments and the businesses that are active in their supply chains, which can help businesses identify new diversification opportunities and help governments identify regulatory obstacles to diversification. We're also helping policymakers share best practices with risk management in our supply chain interdependency network and the OECD Forum on Critical Supply Chains. Through our Trade Committee, we have also collected experiences on economic coercion, its broader impacts and how to manage it, from jurisdictions including Australia, Lithuania, Japan and Moldova, to support the identification of best practices in response. And we're supporting dialogue focused on the particular challenges of complex supply chains. For example, our semiconductor informal exchange network, which Australia actively participates in, helps to enhance the transparency on semiconductor production data and semiconductor-related policies, bringing together government, labour, civil society and business representatives. Third, by helping countries enable further investment to increase production in key supply chains, including by improving infrastructure and tackling regulatory burdens. Supply chain diversification can be a powerful force for growth and development around the world, with countries such as Mexico, Thailand and Vietnam having seen their exports rise as a direct result of trade between China and the United States having fallen. The right policy environment is essential to make the most of these opportunities and ensure shifting trade patterns do not weigh on global growth. We are, for example, undertaking studies with Costa Rica, Indonesia, Mexico, Panama, the Philippines and Vietnam to identify bottlenecks in local semiconductor supply chains. These studies provide targeted advice on ensuring an enabling environment for semiconductor manufacturing, including regulatory frameworks, skills strategies and policies to enhance diversification of input sources. More broadly, we are helping countries address barriers to the trade in services, which are a key input for expanding production in a broad range of industries, including manufacturing and mineral production. The OECD's Services Trade Restrictiveness Index also shows Australia as performing very well, as the 9th least restrictive out of 50 countries currently covered. However, barriers in key enabling sectors such as transportation or information technology are on the rise in key jurisdictions such as Indonesia and Vietnam, which risks holding back development and growth. I'm confident that the OECD accession process will have beneficial impacts across Southeast Asia more broadly beyond accession candidate countries, Indonesia and Thailand, when it comes to these questions. Infrastructure is another key enabler of scaling up production. Here at the OECD, we will be hosting the Secretariat for the Blue Dot Network, the world's first certification framework for quality infrastructure projects, which has been developed with Australia's support. The network provides a voluntary, private sector-focused and government-supported certification scheme for infrastructure projects. Blue Dot Network certifications will be a powerful tool supporting countries to attract critical infrastructure finance and providing businesses with an internationally recognized way to meet investor and customer expectations on sustainability. Fourth, by providing objective data and analysis to support trade liberalization, including by supporting discussions at the WTO. By improving subsidy transparency across agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels and industrial sectors, our data provides a sound evidence base for further progress in negotiations on subsidies. Our analysis supported the renewal of the e-commerce moratorium secured at this year's 13th WTO Ministerial Conference to support continued growth in digital trade. We're also tracking export restrictions in key areas such as critical minerals, where the number of restrictions has increased more than fivefold over the last decade. Because Very sensibly, Australia does not impose any such restrictions. It has a particularly important role as a source of secure and reliable supply of these minerals going forward. Fifth, by helping countries implement sound foreign investment controls that address national security concerns without undermining market functioning and business certainty. The OECD's data suggests foreign investment restrictions have been on the rise since 2008. When well designed, they can be a valuable tool to address risks such as non-market-based investments in critical infrastructure or advanced technology, which are coming into greater focus in light of growing geopolitical tensions. However, arbitrary, opaque and politicized processes can undermine certainty and limit beneficial foreign investment at a time when it is much needed to support jobs, innovation and new infrastructure. The OECD's recommendation on guidelines for recipient country investment policies relating to national security sets out key principles to help balance openness with necessary risk mitigation, including non-discrimination, transparency, predictability, proportionality, and accountability. Sixth, by helping governments design sound industrial policies. A growing set of countries across the OECD are adopting industrial policies in order to boost growth, employment, and resilience, seeking to address key trading dependencies and to enable the digital and green transformations from the semiconductor strategies in the EU and the US to the GX green transformation strategy in Japan and others. For these initiatives to be effective, it is essential that they leverage rather than undermine well-functioning markets. We cannot afford to engage in a subsidy race. Rather, we need well-targeted investments focused on generating knowledge, spillovers, and tackling well-defined market failures. Towards this, we've compiled evidence on industrial policy interventions to help identify what works and what doesn't work. Our analysis shows that the right foundational policies like effective competition policy and low trading barriers are key. Research and development tax credits and subsidies have been shown to be effective in stimulating innovation, but when it comes to targeted grants provided directly to businesses, these should be focused on young and small firms to maximize impacts. For larger, better established firms, public loans or guarantees can be more effective, particularly to help de-risk investments that are likely to generate significant public returns. The OECD's recommendation on competitive neutrality also provides guidance for governments that can shape their industrial strategies so as to avoid disrupting a level playing field, as well as a framework for thinking about sources of disruptions from distortionary conduct in other jurisdictions. Seventh, on enhancing the social and environmental sustainability of trade and investment. Making trade work better for people is a matter of economic security. As we seek to expand and diversify global supply chains, we need businesses to conduct due diligence on those supply chains to manage potential negative impacts from respect for labour rights to addressing risks of corruption and pollution. This is essential to ensure that investments are compatible with our values and broader policy objectives, to protect the social license to operate and to strengthen relationships with the countries that will play an increasingly important role in the shifting configuration of global supply chains. The OECD's standards and tools on responsible business conduct help create a level playing field for responsible businesses, while providing guidance on ensuring due diligence is risk-based and proportionate. This helps avoid counterproductive divestment in developing countries. We updated our guidelines for multinational enterprises last year to provide businesses with strategies to enhance the credibility, comparability, and the tracking of businesses' net zero transition commitments, the responsible deployment of AI technologies, and preventing improper political involvement such as influencing policies with misleading data. Finally, we need ambitious action on climate change which is globally as effective as we need it to be and which is as global trade friendly as possible. It is global trade friendly climate action that benefits from open markets with strong trade and investment flows that will help us keep the costs of the transition down. With a diversity of approaches to carbon mitigation around the world, there are significant risks of negative cross-border spillover effects as a result of insufficiently well coordinated and insufficiently coherent action across individual jurisdictions around the world. Negative spillover risks like carbon leakage, trade tensions triggered by climate protectionism, just to name two key negative spillover risks. When what we need is to identify and seize all possible opportunities of positive cross-border spillovers, ensuring that all countries can benefit from the latest innovations and cost gains, and that in a global market all countries can make their best contribution based on their specific opportunities to help achieve the global objective of carbon neutrality. For this purpose, at the OECD, we have established the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which has now 59 members from around the world, including 14 G20 economies, with others, including China, actively participating in the work as invitees. It is designed to help optimize the global emissions reduction impact of efforts around the world through comprehensive and systematic data and information sharing about carbon mitigation approaches around the world, through evidence-based mutual learning on what works best and what doesn't work so well, and by providing a platform for inclusive multilateral dialogue on how to best achieve our global climate objectives while avoiding counterproductive climate policy-related trade disputes. The bottom line is that open, well-functioning markets will help us keep the costs of the climate transition lower and more affordable than it would be in a climate protectionist environment. In closing, the sustainable expansion of global trade and investment remains one of the most important drivers of further economic development and growth, as well as the related and consequential increases in incomes and living standards, including and especially for developing and emerging market economies around the world. We have a shared interest in supporting and strengthening it, and this is a core motivating principle of the OECD's global engagement beyond our membership. We continue to broaden the reach of our standards and best practices, including on trade, to enhance their effectiveness and impact, and to provide a globally better coordinated policy environment for businesses and investment. The Indo-Pacific remains a key priority region for these efforts, given it is an increasingly important center of global growth, trade and population, and given the region's central role in helping to address shared global challenges. We work with like-minded countries across Asia and all around the world who share concerns with our members about economic coercion and security, and who are deeply committed to further alignment with OECD standards. And of course, we will continue to pursue with great enthusiasm and energy the accession processes for Indonesia and Thailand, the Southeast Asia's biggest and second biggest economies. We also continue to pursue productive engagement with other countries in the region that have differing views, focusing on opportunities for mutually beneficial dialogue and cooperation on an equal footing. We cannot make progress on climate change or boosting global growth and development without them. This allows me to close on an optimistic note. Trade is the foundation of our shared prosperity. Nowhere is this more clear than in Australia. Let's continue to reach out to the many willing partners across the world so that we can optimize the transitions underway in our economies and societies, so we can make trade work better and use sound evidence-based strategies to strengthen our economic security without compromising opportunity and prosperity. Thank you.
So I think that was quite a useful international complement to Secretary Kennedy's address, both, I think, highlighting the theme right through the day of balancing these competing objectives, but trying to do it through a disciplined, principles-based lens and having that permanent interaction with the policy practitioners who are sort of doing things in real time. And I think, to my mind, that's part of the interplay of what this conference is all about. We're now going to hear a particular view from East Asia on the future of the rules-based order from Professor Myung-Hee Yu. Professor Yu is the visiting professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. From February 2019 to August 2021, she served as the Trade Minister of the Republic of Korea, the first female Trade Minister of the Republic of Korea. She has a distinguished career in Korean trade policy. She also has the singular distinction in the room of being the person who had to look across the table at Robert Lighthizer during Trade Policy Mark I. So I think we'll hold that back for the Q&A. But my pleasure in welcoming Professor Yu to the stage.
Thank you for the interesting introduction. And good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to participate in this conference and share my views on the future of rules-based order. And as he introduced, having served in the trade sector in the Korean government from 1992 to 2021, I might be considered as a relic of the golden era of trade or golden era of globalization. And perhaps I am one of the last members of the rules-based order school. However, as he said, I was not fortunate enough to be confined to this traditional viewpoint. As a trade minister and also chief negotiator for Korea-US FTA renegotiation during the Trump administration, I was at the forefront of the turn of the tide and experiencing firsthand of this shift from rules-based to security-driven trade governance, which significantly impacted our trade policy as well as broader rules-based economic order. So reflecting on my own experience as well as all the discussions that we have had all morning and afternoon, it seems that the pursuit of economic security becomes the defining feature of our current economic and trade policy. Well, while some economic security measures are necessary to tackle the geopolitical and geo-economic challenges of our time, also at the same time, such unilateral or some the unilateral economic security measures risk undermining the rules-based trade system that has long supported our economic growth and stability. And against this backdrop, I would like to discuss now the 3 points. First, the perils of unilateral economic security measures. And second, the importance of the rules-based order, especially from East Asia's perspective. And third, the way forward, the future of the rules-based economic order. So let me now first address the perils of the current economic security measures, especially the spread of unilateral economic security measures. Well, while countries might have some valid reasons to pursue those economic security measures, those policies all come at a cost. And you know all the costs that because we discussed in the morning and afternoon. And in particular, many of these measures are being adopted unilaterally, sometimes without proper coordination or policy red lines agreed upon, even among like-minded countries. And such actions could lead to a less certain and less secure international environment rather than a more secure one. As economic securities cannot be used as a blank check, we must strike the right balance between restricting trade for security concerns and, on the other hand, preserving the rules-based system that has served the world so well for the last 8 decades. And let me now share East Asia's perspective on the rules-based order, which has proven its importance through the region's own experience. The rules-based trading system centered on the WTO has been a key driver of economic growth across the globe, delivering stability and predictability in international trade. And despite current headlines about increasing tariffs or trade restrictions, such as those recent tariff increase on Chinese EVs by both the US and EU, 75% of global trade still operates under multilateral terms. And this order has been particularly pivotal to East Asia's economic success and regional stability over the past decades. And even in this era of economic security, East Asian economies are more integrated with global supply chains and the global economy. And with an average trade to GDP ratio of 105% in 2022, which is much higher than 27% of the US or than those number of any other region in the world. It's natural that East Asia remains a strong advocate of open trade and the rules-based economic order. So just for example, when I was a trade minister, despite the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, we finalized ICEP regional comprehensive economic partnership agreements among 15 countries through year-long virtual meetings. Just imagine 15 ministers and hundreds of delegations participating in negotiations online throughout the year. And we were able to conclude the negotiations successfully through those online meetings. And that's the East Asia's belief in open trade and also rules-based trading system. And in this vein, East Asia is also more susceptible to the disintegration of the rules-based trading system than any other region, and thus is wary of the proliferation of de-risking or decoupling measures, which, if taken too far, could upend the rules-based trading system. However, this is not to suggest that the existing system and existing order is without its weaknesses. While the economic landscape has changed a lot, but multilateral rules have not kept pace. This underscores the need for institutions like the WTO to adapt and evolve, making it even more important, not less, to develop new rules and frameworks to address emerging challenges. And let me now move on to the current state of the multilateral trading system and how can the new economic order, how the rules-based order can be rebuilt or strengthened. The multilateral trading system is now under grave threat with its rulebook largely unchanged since the 1990s and causing it to lose its relevance, especially in this era of heightened economic security. And given just geopolitical realities, revolutionary reform to rebuild this rules-based order is not feasible. At this point, I would really like to quote Alan Beatty. He said that, well, I don't have a solution, but I really admire the problem. But I'm not a journalist. I used to be a trade practitioner. So I feel always, as a trade practitioner, I feel always obligated to suggest a solution, even though that is not perfect. We shouldn't let the perfect we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I would rather suggest a more incremental or a gradual evolutionary idea, although this is not perfect. The WTO should, or the multilateral institutions should work together to make this rules-based order better by expanding the trade agenda first, and also by adopting various paths with flexible approaches. Let me just discuss these two aspects one by one. First, let's consider the expansion of the trade agenda. To strengthen the economic order, both nations and multilateral institutions like the WTO need to move beyond merely advocating against protectionism or fragmentation, but also explore how they can address the concerns driving economic security by expanding the trade agenda beyond market liberalization and efficiency. And also, given the poor track record of the comprehensive multilateral negotiations, perhaps a pragmatic way forward is to make progress where possible, perhaps through plurilateral sectoral arrangements in areas where there is a considerable consensus. And possible areas for such sectoral arrangements include economic security, climate and trade, and the digital economy. For instance, in a sectoral arrangement on economic security, nations could coordinate industrial policies to avoid subsidy races while strengthening supply chains for critical products. At the same time, they could address the trade security nexus by enhancing transparency and also ensuring that these security-related measures are focused and proportionate. And a second area could be trade and climate agreements. Coordinating climate-related trade measures and policies could make a trade an important part of the solution to the climate crisis and could also reduce green trade tensions arising from diverging climate-related unilateral measures. And third area could be the digital economy, which includes issues around data flow, privacy, localization, and cybersecurity. And second aspect, in terms of the approach, incrementalism and flexibility could help develop new rules that are needed to tackle complex and evolving issues in a turbulent world. Given the current impasse in achieving multilateral rules, open plurilateral agreements present a second-best option by updating rules. However, in reality, even open plurilateral agreements within the WTO face constraints, making limited progress and unable to address challenging issues. So consequently, bilateral and regional agreements or arrangements such as CPTPP, ICEP, or IPEF, they could also serve as platforms for discussing rules, acceptable parameters, or policy red lines and guardrails on key issues related to economic security or climate and digital economy. As existing multilateral rules are increasingly outdated, whether through multilateral, regional, or bilateral arrangements, having some form of governance in place is better than waiting for a perfect binding multilateral agreements. Through these efforts collectively through multi-layered frameworks and arrangements could mitigate the negative spillover effects of unilateral measures and could also pave the way for rules for wider memberships through our concerted efforts and thereby contributing to a well-functioning rules-based system. I will stop here and happy to answer your question later in the panel session. Thank you.
You take the one. I'll now ask Alan, Beattie, and George Mina to come up. And so we've got about half an hour before we, tech willing, switch to Brussels. So that gives us, I think, enough time to dig into some of these issues. I won't reintroduce Alan. He's well known to us from the start of the day. Although I will give a plug that in your program, there's a subscription offer to the Financial Times. So you should look at that. Obviously, you can get to read Trade Secrets every Monday, Alan, roughly?
Every Monday. Yep.
Every Monday, there you go. So that's in there. But I want to firstly introduce my good friend George Mina, who's the Deputy Secretary of Trade Investment Group at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for Australia. George has recently returned from Geneva as our WTO ambassador, so he's been very much doing God's work in a difficult environment, shall we say. But look, I might pick up on that, George. We've heard, I guess, degrees of pessimism throughout the day about the system, and a sense of an expanding yard and fence, and that, by definition, encroaching into the rules-based system and the reach of it. Notwithstanding, we've still had some positive trends on trade, and I think Myung-hee's just alluded to some of the things that we can't give up on and we need to press ahead in terms of perhaps other approaches. Based on your deep experience with the WTO, where's it at and what's worth fighting for?
Well, John, first of all, congratulations to you and Mike and the team on this conference. You said you're a recovering trade economist. I'm a recovering rules enthusiast. And I think where it's at is, I think Myung-Hee put it very, very well. So did Mathias, by the way. Middle powers like Australia, the system that governs global trade, 98% of trade is underwritten by World Trade rules. 78% of our trade is underwritten by the free trade agreements that are written on top of those rules. For middle powers like us, we find our economic security fundamentally in the system, in the global rules-based trading system. It's a very unfashionable thing to say these days, but I'll say it. And it's very important that we don't forget that, because we do need to fight, to say what's worth fighting for, quite a bit. I mean, this is effectively, the WTO is sort of the most arcane institute. It really puts people to sleep, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's really not a great topic to spend a lot of time on. But, this is a system effectively that buffers against power. I mean, that's what it's about, 60-odd treaties buffering against the exercise of power. That's why we've been able to take the United States, the European Union, and China most recently, all to the world trading system, and have succeeded in every case that we did. And it's been central to our ability to handle some of the pressures that we've been facing with respect to China recently on barley and wine. For those in the Australian audience who understand that set of circumstances, again, it was the WTO and the arcane dispute settlement system to which you and have both referred, Alan, earlier today. That has been so fundamental, because this is the most voluminous body of public international law. It's the most enforceable body of law, and law's a bit of a dirty word when it comes to economic security, but it is where we find our strength. So the bits that are worth fighting for are the same bits that Mathias and Myung-Hee have highlighted today. Number one, an enforceable system of rules backed by a dispute settlement system that works. Americans walked away from the appellate body. We patched it up together with Europe in respect of this multi-party interim appeals arrangement. Really, really boring now, but incredibly important. And that little bit of architecture that we preserved 4 or 5 years ago has been fundamental to our ability to sustain that power that we can exercise in the pursuit of a rules-based approach on trade. Because with about 45 countries around the globe, we do have a functioning appeal system. The Americans are not in it, as you rightly said this morning, Alan. They're not in it, but China's in it, European Union's in it, and we're working very closely with a whole range of others to build that out. So the first bit that's worth preserving is that dispute architecture. Absolutely crucial. The second bit's the bit that both Mathias and Myung-Hee have highlighted, and that's the rule-making arm. You see, we are all going to have to, including in our domestic policy, we don't want to be naive about this, incorporate, accommodate security imperatives in a proportionate way, of course, in our domestic political setups. But what we also need to do is make sure the system flexes and the system accommodates, because if it doesn't, it just gets ignored. National security is part of that. The security exception in world trade law, we can go into that if people want to. But I think a couple of other important imperatives. Number one, I would add to the security imperative, I'd add the industrial policy imperative. Some of the ideas that Jonathan raised earlier today about the non-market practices that the United States is seeing as so critical. Why can't we band together, build some deeper disciplines on non-market practice? We have rules in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we can build on those, on SOEs, for instance, and on industrial subsidies. We should double down on rulemaking in that area. And of course, the climate transition, net zero. We can't have the WTO missing in action. It has to play its part on the climate transition. There's a huge amount that we can do there. Middle powers, I think, South Korea, Japan, UK, Australia, Canada, a whole range of us. Really, we do have agency, and we really need to stand up and exercise it.
Thanks, George. Maybe, Alan, if you want to pick up on that in terms of particularly the rulemaking element and what is still possible. We talked about climate-related digital. Is this an area where, frankly, the consensus approach is moribund, and it's just coalitions that are willing, being able to do things, even if that means leaving behind a most favoured nation sort of shibboleth.
Yeah, first let me just say, I have a long-standing shtick about being incredibly rude about the WTO, right? It's sort of part of my brand. I'm slightly constrained here because I'm sitting next to two people whom I respect greatly, one of whom worked at the WTO and one of whom wanted to run the WTO. So let me say quite seriously, the thing with the WTO, it is not an issue of personnel. It is not an issue of personnel or tactics or how it is run. You could put anyone to run the WTO, right? Any of the great leaders of history. George Washington, Charlemagne, Genghis Khan, right? Even Bob Hawke could not revive the WTO. I would argue, in fact, it's not that we've abandoned the multilateral rule-making system, it's that we never really had one. Bearing in mind, the WTO as such only dates to 1995. Before that, we had the GATT, which wasn't really a proper organization. The GATT was not really a multilateral organization. As I said this morning, it was a relatively small club of countries held together by kind of the glue of being Cold War allies. Deals were stitched up by four rich powers, the US, the EU, Canada, and Japan. It was when the WTO was expanded, took on a lot more members, eventually including China, became a proper rule-making body, and gained a proper dispute settlement system, which, by the way, is a bright spot, which I will talk about. That's the point at which it actually started to fail. Since 1995, the WTO has not concluded one single major negotiated deal. A couple of little things on trade facilitation, but not one major deal. And this is not even really to do with China. All the critiques about not being able to contain China are true. But the major deal, the Doha Round, Doha Development Agenda, was failing by the mid-2000s, only a few years after China joined. The point is, it's ungovernable because it is now a large organization containing a lot of disparate views, which still governs by consensus. Pascal Lamy, who was the Director General, had the best description. I think he said it was medieval. Right? You imagine trying to select a pope with a conclave of 160-something cardinals, some of whom absolutely hate each other, at least two of whom aren't actually Christian and don't understand why you need a pope anyway. That's the situation that the WTO is in, and a huge amount of work has been done, and it has been done by really smart people, really principled people from all sorts of different angles. And yet we are where we are. The idea of coming up with coalitions of the willing is an excellent one. That is something that I remember supporting from an early stage. The FT supported from an early stage when the Doha round collapsed. It hasn't been proved possible because it hasn't been possible to get together enough of a coalition of the willing. You have one or two members. You have one member, specifically India, who positively like seeing WTO agreements fail, even if it has nothing to do with them. And if you doubt this, you only have to attend a meeting. I was at the ministerial in UAE a couple of months ago. There was a deal on fisheries. This would have been a really good deal to do because it would have been the WTO going into an environmental public good, constraining fishing subsidies, not just a traditional trade deal, right? A global public good. It was quite a thin deal, it had quite a lot of holes in it, and India decided to trash it right at the last minute. I have seen footage of the negotiating sessions where people from the Pacific Island states were literally in tears. It was not actually going to affect Indian fishers at all. It's just part of their ideology that they do not want deals to happen, and so they trashed it. And we of course know that the US never really liked being constrained by it, and has now exited the dispute settlement body. So, a lot of good work is tried to be done there, but on the rulemaking side, I'm afraid it hasn't really succeeded. And no, I don't see much prospect of really good binding plurilateral deals. The dispute settlement system, on the other hand, is a remarkable bright spot, despite the fact that the US has left it. As George said, the EU and Australia and others reconstructed it. And here's the thing about, it's worth knowing this, thinking this about China. Everyone says the WTO can't contain China. That is true. But it's not actually that China breaks the rules of the WTO. China is actually quite active in the WTO and has a pretty good record of complying with the rules. It's just that the rules of the WTO don't really constrain a lot of Chinese state capitalism. Nonetheless, the dispute settlement continues. And a lot of the really good work it does, everyone at the WTO will tell you this, is not actually the highly publicized cases, right, where you actually bring a case on electric vehicles and so on. It's the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disputes which are diffused at an early stage in a committee which nobody ever hears about. It's all about the fights that don't happen, not the fights that do happen in public. Let me just give one example of how the dispute settlement could actually still have one of its most valuable things to do. If the world is going to get an international carbon price, my view is, notwithstanding what anyone at the OECD wants, negotiations there, whatever, it will happen one way and one way only, which is the European Union's carbon price internationalized through the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That will get other countries to adopt it, otherwise they won't be able to export to the EU. It's the old Brussels effect in action again. It will undoubtedly be litigated at the WTO. India has already threatened it. What will probably happen is the dispute settlement system will say, actually, the principle of what you're trying to do is fine, but you're not really doing it fairly because that bit's not fair, that bit's not fair. Can't you try constructing a shadow price? Can't you do it like this? And then the EU will refine it and bring it back, and refine it and bring it back. And so there'll be a process of sort of iterative, almost negotiation through litigation at the WTO. And along the way, the CBAM will gain some degree of international legitimacy, not through negotiation, because it won't be negotiated, but through a litigation process, which is the closest that we come now to multilateral negotiation, right? Now, saving the planet, right, through a unilateral border measure, litigated iteratively through an international treaty-based organization is not really the optimal way of doing it. It is, however, and here is where I absolutely do agree, it is the only way of doing it, because if the WTO goes completely, there is nothing that will remotely fulfill those functions which it's trying to do.
Do I detect a hint of Alan Beattie optimism in that remark?
I did actually specifically write a whole trade secret saying, I am now going to put the optimistic case for the WTO. I was accused of having been kidnapped and reading out hostage statements and so forth from it.
Can I ask the other panellists to respond on the climate issue? I mean, it's something that I'm sort of ambivalent about, because I also read Catherine Tai's speeches and think that's the last thing you want to be throwing into the WTO in that form. But I mean, is this the vehicle for us to do? I mean, I'm assuming if it doesn't interconnect, we'll be in a world of pain anyway. So we need to find some mechanism to deal with climate in the WTO. Is that accurate?
Well, so that's why I said that it could be discussed in the WTO or outside the WTO. That's why I mentioned the incremental and flexible approach. Of course, the multilateral consensus and multilateral approach is the most ideal and the best, but we cannot wait for the perfect, the most best multilateral consensus. That's why, if that is not feasible at the moment, or when those consensus stalls, we could try, even outside the WTO, the plurilateral arrangement among the like-minded countries, to have a sectoral arrangement on climate and trade-related issues, to putting together critical mineral arrangement on the one hand, and also maybe all those CBAM-related type measures. Even the U.S. is considering imposing foreign Pollution Fee Act or something like the similar measures, all those carbon border mechanisms, together with some maybe green industrial policies as well in one big package. So those kind of discussions, if within the WTO, if it is hard to make a progress, like-minded countries can discuss those issues, and those discussions and arrangements could serve as a building block or a stepping stone for some rules or guidelines for wider membership. Yeah.
George, do you want to also pick up maybe a bit on digital at the end of that?
Well, that's right. Just on the WTO and the net zero transition, though, I think there's an enormous role for the agency, again, of middle powers to step up and step in. And I don't want to get too ecclesiastical, Alan, but the points you make about the kind of canonical approach and the and the popes are well made, but there of course are opportunities to make progress without sort of upending Vatican II. One of them is simply trying to drive rulemaking in small clubs. We've done that. We did it in the big clubs, by the way, in fisheries subsidies in 2022. We've done it with domestic regulation, 60-odd countries on services at the WTO in 2022. We did it again on investment last year with 100-odd countries, again, breakthrough at the WTO on that, and then finally on digital. We're just about on the precipice of a deal on digital and e-commerce with about 90 countries at the WTO. Now, Alan's right. There are a couple of big countries blocking. South Africa, India are saying this isn't consistent with the theology. I mean, these theological debates get pretty detailed and extensive. We need to drive through that. Let's be very clear. The weight of international opinion is still behind constructive rulemaking efforts, and that is true on net zero, it is true on nature. And two ideas that we should be pursuing. Number one, a coordinated approach to border measures on carbon. Now, it doesn't matter what your stance is, in 10 or 15 years, there'll be at least a dozen of these measures applied to world trade, and that has a seriously deleterious effect on openness and rules, in fact, if we haven't got a coordinated approach to methodology of carbon at the border, how we integrate the systems with one another. I mean, I hear Alan's bid for a Brussels effect. That's one approach. Another approach is to get in a room, as Mathias said, and do it in Paris or in Geneva. I don't really mind where we do it. We've got to be pragmatic about that, but we do need a coordinated approach on approaches to carbon, measured carbon at the border. The second thing we should be doing on net zero is tackling the enormous subsidy agenda and doing that through the place that's got the tools. It's weird that the only place that can really, discipline and enforceable law subsidies to global agriculture happens to be at the World Trading System. But it is the case. And we've got about I'm not over-egging it here to say by 2030 it'll be at least $1 trillion US global on agricultural subsidies. The impact of that collectively on nature conservation, on net zero, on distortions to land use emissions is enormous, given the 25 to 30% stake that agriculture and land use has in global emissions. And again, small group of countries can and should be starting work. There's actually a bunch already considering this in the context of the Cairns Group to drive rulemaking on this issue. So I think there are things that we can be doing and should be doing. Again, it's sort of, we can't be waiting around for the middle powers. We can't be sort of yielding either to the blockers, as Alan says, on consensus. But there are ways to drive through.
So I'm reminded it's 80 years from next month since Bretton Woods, I think. So maybe we should convene something pretty quickly in Sydney or Canberra. Can I hook in the OECD and picking up on Mathias? I mean, there is a sense in which, with the China challenge, the strategic competitive environment, it should be a time for the OECD to be stepping up as the club of liberal democracies, market-based economies, rule of law, etc. What's got to happen at the OECD? Is there something we can look to there? I mean, they, as Mathias alluded to, they've got a very rich body of data that they're working on. I think they're doing some good work on things like supply chain resilience. But should we be pushing in again in a mini club the OECD into this economic security territory?
Well, the problem with the OECD, they do terrific work, they have really good data, they do excellent research, they do cutting-edge research on carbon and so forth. The problem is it's a rich country club, right? No deal means anything unless you have India and China in it. India and China, in this case, I think quite understandably resent having to do things at the OECD. There was the partial initial deal on minimum corporate taxes, but not beyond that. So I know I tend to regard the OECD as a very highly skilled and technocratic organisation which feeds into other processes. I'll just bring one thing up with it because I think it's incredibly important that we do this now. With carbon border, if you all have, and the Americans are seizing onto this carbon border, if you all implement a carbon border measure without having a domestic carbon border price, that's not a decarbonisation programme, that's protectionism. right? That's our friends, the steelworkers in Pennsylvania, who found yet another way, right, to protect themselves. I'm honestly not a spokesperson for the EU. I spent 6 years in Brussels. I'm really not a spokesperson for the EU. I would not choose the EU to be the body that comes up with a global carbon price, because they're slow and they're iterative and they're bureaucratic, and then they put it in the hands of people who don't actually understand the rest of the world in this case and so on. Right, the climate directorate rather than the trade directorate. And it's, you know, sorry, the tax directorate rather than the climate directorate in charge of deforestation, which is an even bigger mess. So I wouldn't necessarily choose it. But what they are doing is intellectually consistent, and it is likely to be WTO legal. Whacking on a carbon border tax without any without a domestic counterpart doesn't actually decarbonize. It just rewards you for your perception of what you've done in the past. And it's discriminatory. So I'm actually extremely nervous, and I see John Podesta has now been made the White House climate czar, and he starts making all these speeches about how we must be multilateral and we must get together on carbon border. I'm sorry, I just see the protectionism appearing yet again behind another banner. And that's why I think the EU route is not the way I would wish it. The EU route is the only one that works, because that is the only place that has, the only large economy that has a coherent internal carbon price that works, and whose carbon border tax is a natural, logical, fair, ecological, and probably WTO compliant extension of it.
We are the US Study Centre. We will have a US election this year. Yonghi, I alluded to the fact that you had to sit across the table and recut a deal with Robert Lighthizer. Perhaps give everyone a little bit of a taste for that. And then more generally, I guess, are we taking Lighthizer both seriously and literally, and Trump seriously and literally, about 60% tariffs and 10% on everyone?
I think everyone is taking it very seriously, because we've all experienced the policy of the Trump administration. And also, well, actually, reflecting on my experience of the Trump administration, when Peter Navarro first argued economic security is national security, what he meant was that those countries with which U.S. had a trade deficit, actually, you know who are on the list: Korea, Japan, EU, Mexico, as well as China. They were threat to economic security, by extension to national security, and they were the target for trade restrictive actions like quotas or tariffs. And we would have the same situation in second Trump administration if he gets elected. But that's not the end of story. They would give them a huge leverage in their negotiation, because depending on the circumstances, after imposing those restrictions, they still remain open to negotiations, depending on the circumstances. And in that regard, Lighthizer was a very effective counterpart, to be honest, in narrowing down the gaps and getting the deal done if the acceptable terms reached between the two sides, and if you were thoroughly prepared for the negotiations. So in our case, I was the lead chief negotiator for the Korea-US FTA renegotiation. And in the beginning, they demanded like tens of amendments, like almost like 50 requests, unilateral requests. But at the end of the day, we managed to conclude renegotiation, amending only 5 to 6 items, including both sides' requests, within 3 months. So I would say, at least we could work together toward the same, mutually satisfactory outcome in that regard. But in that regard, I would like to still emphasize the importance of the rules-based order or some rules, because economic security is such an elastic concept. To them, the U.S. trade deficit was threat to economic security. So the tariffs rules used to address the U.S. Economic security. So in that regard, I'm just, that poses a very important question to us, whether we should work together to define or to agree upon some minimum rules or guidelines on what are the acceptable parameters, or some policy red lines, or something that we can rely on to withstand the difficult times, so that when these economic security measures are used against like-minded countries, what are some minimum rules that we can rely on? So that is some question that we should think about before whoever comes, the next leader of whatever country in the future. Yeah.
George and Alan, the tariff prospect, forces to restrain it within the American system, do you think? Are they still there under Trump? Mark II?
I mean, in my case, I can probably just add very briefly to his point that, of course, there'll be pressures inside the system to counteract and so forth, but continuity and change. Well, continuity, I think we can expect a continued interest in and focus on non-market policies and practices. Again, no reason why we can't stand up a rules-making response to that, and a focus on the security exception. The security exception was written in 1948. It's got language on fissile materials, and it's a different era, a different conception of global security. And so if you really want to tackle that question of the security exception of world trade law, and I think we need to have a deep dialogue with whomever comes into power in the United States after November. Both of these issues require, us to keep our bearings and us to keep our eyes on the sort of principles we've always applied. A cooperative and collaborative approach with others, including the middle powers, rules-based approach, and one that keeps its eye firmly on openness right throughout.
Alan, your last word.
Do I think there are forces within the US system constrain Trump? Unfortunately, no. No, I don't. Because I think the tariff policy has now become detached from anything economic and has become largely symbolic. The farm states that got clobbered by China's retaliation, nonetheless, yes, I know there were some shifts within it. More or less, they continue to vote for Trump. That's something I'm afraid to say I'm really pessimistic about. Not only do I not have a solution to that one, I'm actually really terrified of the problem.
Okay. On that note, we will have some positive news at the end of the day, but I'm just going to check now, and could you thank our panellists for this great session? And I understand we can now cross to Brussels. I will briefly introduce Denny Rednay. Denny was appointed the Deputy Director General and Chief Trade Enforcement Officer in the Director General for Trade in the European Commission in 2020. He is, in a sense, one of the key architects of Europe's economic security strategy, which, if you've been reading the FT, is evolving almost on a daily basis and in new ways, but with also, I think, that European technocratic attempt to, as we have been exploring all day, thread the needle, find the balance in all these instruments. So if Denny is with us, I would like to pass to him to give us some remarks about Europe's economic security strategy in practice. Over to you, Denny.
Very good. I actually see myself now down under.
Good to go.
Good, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this kind of invitation. I would, of course, have loved to be present physically with you. I listened to the end of the preceding panel, where I was very interested to hear remarks by George, with whom we are on overall trade issues, but also on these particular issues pertaining to economic security. Continuing to work closely and wanting to work closely with Australia, given the fact that we are convinced that we have, in the face of some of these changes in international economic relations, a priori a lot of like-mindedness. So I'm happy to give you, if that's of interest, a sort of state of play of where we are in our thinking in the policy development in the economic security space. I think we have come to the view, let me start maybe with a broader issue. We've come to the view that this is not a short-term issue. There's a structural change going on here. And in particular, we think that in international economic relations, we will be continuing to experience in the coming years, probably decades, what in our view amounts to a paradigm shift, which is that we will have a system of governance, which is going to be, of course, anchored still in a logic of efficiency as the organizing principle of international economic relations, but one where, alongside efficiency, we will have to more seriously and more systematically take account of the fact that there will be an element of security and resilience that comes into play. And the whole question will be how to balance in this new paradigm these two logics and these two drivers of further global economic integration and perhaps here and there pockets of lesser integration or even de-integration in some cases, not least because of the different relations between how hard geopolitics is impacting international economic relations between states, and all this leading to a world which we do not believe is an optimal world, where the rules-based international economic order, in part, here and there, and hopefully not significantly, will give way to slightly more power-based type economic relations. And for us as European Union, the whole question has been over the last years to figure out how we navigate this new environment. And so this is why the European Commission has proposed to the member states of the European Union to develop and to implement an economic security strategy. We have specificities, of course, in Europe. We are not a unitary state. This is why we have, in a way, to have an explicit economic security strategy, a compact framework to work jointly between the center, so the EU institutions, and the member states of the European Union, who in these areas, particularly, which are less traditionally integrated areas into the single market, retain significant national competence. And therefore, it is a more complicated game than what we have been able to do in terms of taking forward an open markets trade and investment policy, for example. That economic strategy effectively has to give meaning and has to give definition to the notion of de-risking our economy, de-risking the single market of the European Union vis-a-vis external threats or unwanted dependencies. And that is what the different work streams under the European economic security strategy are there to address. The strategy which the Commission put on the table in the form of a sort of white paper, if you want, just about a year ago now, rests on a number of principles and pillars. It rests on the idea that an economic security strategy has to have a promote pillar, where we promote our competitiveness, our economic, industrial, and technological base in order to ensure and enhance its resilience. A protect component, where there we would have to strengthen part of our toolbox in order to make sure that we avoid risks associated with dependencies, whether it is risks of weaponization of those dependencies, whether it is risks of technology leakage, and a partner pillar, because we are not going to do this within the confines of the single market. We remain a globally integrated economy, and the competitiveness of EU industry depends not just on the preservation of, for example, the level playing field in the domestic market, which we are deploying tools to ensure, for example, very recently with respect to defending the internal market against subsidized imports of Chinese EVs. But we also need to maintain global competitiveness, and therefore we need to remain connected to the international economy vastly and significantly, and probably more. And I think what we're heading towards is a scenario where you will have, in part, some de-risking leading to, as I said, pockets of lesser integration, but in our hope, a vast part of the global economy that remains globally integrated, and as a matter of fact, which remains increasingly globally integrated. We see, for example, a lot of prospects for more global integration through phenomena such as digital trade, for example, which has the potential to remain an engine of global integration as opposed to global economic fragmentation. Now, that's the strategy, this white paper that we put forward, the European Commission put forward to member states a year ago, foresaw beyond these basic principles, maximizing our openness while minimizing the risks associated with openness, a set of work streams. In October, the Commission adopted a recommendation on critical technology areas for the purpose of further joint risk assessments between the European Commission and member states, focusing in the first stage on key emerging digital technology areas where we believe that we need to look at the promote and protect dimension around these tech areas, advanced semiconductors, AI, quantum, and biotech. There are further sets of technology areas where this kind of work, so this kind of basic risk assessment framework exercise, are going to be developed. The Commission is also conducting, in parallel to these critical tech risk assessments, 3 further risk assessment exercises: one on our industrial supply chain dependencies, one on the risks to our critical infrastructures, and one on the risk of the weaponization of some of our economic dependencies, which is, of course, a bit more complicated because the risk assessment with respect to weaponization and risk of being coerced, with respect to possible dependencies, is, of course, a function of the previous ones. And the idea is this is a joint framework that is iterative between Commission and member states. In March this year, the European Commission submitted a classified non-paper with a first cut of these exercises on the 4 key technology areas, and that work is continuing. Now, beyond the risk assessment on the tools, we have also taken forward a number of initiatives at the beginning of the year in some of the areas that are related to strategic trade controls and strategic investment controls in particular, and how we Europeanize these in a slightly different way. So we have, on the question of strategic investment controls, we have an EU framework of cooperation for the screening of foreign direct investment for security and public order reasons, which is in place. And we have put forward a legislative proposal to our legislative branch, which is the Council of Ministers of the Member States and the European Parliament on the other, to upgrade this legal statute to complete, if you want, for the European Union as a whole, the instrument of foreign direct investment screening. We have also, and this is much more of a soft law preliminary approach, we have also produced a white paper on the potential security risks related to outbound investment, with respect in particular, in our view, to whether outbound investment can create a problem from the point of view of know-how leakage or technology leakage in critical technology areas in ways that cannot be addressed through the export control of tech and dual use items. And we are in an examination exercise with member states about this issue of outward investment, possible screening or control mechanisms. On the strategic trade control side, we have an EU framework for the coordination of export control policies by EU member states, We believe that we have to find ways to Europeanize the exercise of these competences by the European member states, in order in particular to reflect new realities with respect to what's happening in the export control space. The fact that the multilateral governance system with respect to strategic trade controls is weakened because of the difficulties of the multilateral export control regimes to function fully. For example, the fact that consensus in Wassenaar can be blocked, notably by Russia. And we need to find a way as Europeans to decide how we deal with those realities, which are of a geopolitical nature, and how to deal with the fact that in all likelihood, there will be more unilateral controls between technology holder jurisdictions on emerging digital technologies in particular, which can be directed to civil-military fusion in destinations of concerns, and where we think that we need to see how the European Union, the 27 member states, need to be able to deal with these new realities as well. So this, together with a focus and a greater focus on issues relating to research security in particular, which is, in our view, part and parcel of those economic security considerations, are the set of work streams that are underway. This is distinct, and I will finish with this, from what we continue to do in terms of taking steps where necessary to ensure that in international economic relations, we have a sufficient level playing field with respect to our international economic relations with our key trading partners. Now, we do this by continuing to engage in free trade agreement negotiation, but we also do this by using a number of autonomous tools where we feel that there are still too many gaps in the global trade rule book with respect to ensuring the level playing field in economic terms, which is different from economic security or essential security in our view. And we're very careful not to have mission creep between the different instruments. So we will also continue alongside these initiatives to deploy trade policy instruments where necessary to level the playing field. And there, as you know, we are a user of traditional trade defense instruments. I referred to this with respect to the situation we feel we are facing on our domestic market with respect to electric vehicle imports from China. We have also developed within our within the limits of our international commitments, a set of additional autonomous instruments relating to the level playing field, where we believe there are gaps in the rule book. And this is why we have developed an instrument to deal with the distortions of foreign subsidies on the internal market of the Union, when those distortions flow through investment as opposed to the importation of goods, because that is the limit of the traditional anti-subsidy disciplines in the WTO. And we have also equipped ourselves with an instrument to deal with the problem of reciprocity in international public procurement globally. I think that there is no doubt in foreign jurisdiction a concern sometimes that the rapid development and extension of this autonomous trade policy toolbox can be a problem and can lead the EU to become more closed or more protected than it otherwise needs to be. We're very careful to make sure that we do not have mission creep on these instruments, that these instruments must correspond to a particular problem and a particular gap in the global trade rule book, which we would otherwise, and I will finish with this, very much want to continue to support. Because for us, at the end of the day, the global trade rules-based system with the WTO at its heart is also a very important guardrail and, in our view, an element of our own economic security going forward. So it's not rules versus tools, it's rules and tools. And it is not autonomous instruments or international cooperation and engagement and governance, it's both at the same time. So perhaps I will leave it there, if that's okay. I hope that gives you, from sunny Brussels, which is not the case, at least an overview of where things stand today in our policy developments.
Denny,
Thanks.
that's a fantastic tour to Horizon. So can you please thank Denny? Before I completely let you get into your day, I might just pose one quick question and come back to the third P on partnership. We have a number of Australian officials participating in this conference, but also officials from the United States, Japan, Korea, Canada, Singapore, New Zealand. If you had to pick one area of partnership in terms of either sectors or tools, is there an area of partnership that you think like-minded countries can perhaps make the most progress on together under the banner of economic security?
Sure. Look, for us again, the partnership dimension, I have to be very clear, did not come as an afterthought. I mean, it's very much central to our thinking. Because again, given how integrated we already are, there's no point thinking about our economic security in an inward-looking manner. So what we are in favor of doing is trying to use a set of engagement frameworks, a diverse set of engagement frameworks to make progress on this and to avoid that economic security instruments become or risks becoming beggar thy neighbor type instruments, including between countries that are a priori like-minded about the types of problems, the types of risks that they want to address. So this is why we're doing this through a whole range of bilateral engagements with a number of big partners. We have a Trade and Technology Council structure with the United States. We have a high-level economic dialogue with Japan. Japan has been, by the way, a source of inspiration for the European Union in the development of its economic security strategy, because like us, Japan has been very explicit in framing that strategy. We are very happy to have initiated recently more discussions again with Australia on these questions, and recent contact with George Mina that we have had in this area. We certainly want to continue to pursue and build on. Then I think we have collective engagement that is very important from our point of view. In this area, the G7, in our view, plays a critical role, but G7 has got to be nimble and flexible enough to extend beyond the G7 in G7 plus formats, in particular in these areas of economic security or the response to economic coercion, where we appreciate very much the work of tools such as the G7 economic coercion platform. But we have been very active in pushing the various G7 presidencies to make sure that this broadens out to other players, and on questions relating to weaponization of dependencies, economic coercion. We have valued a lot the discussions that we have had with Australia in the last few years, which actually have also been for us an element of inspiration for developing our own tools for responses. And as you perhaps know, we have developed a statute, an EU-level statute, to deal with the threats of coercion. I think there's a lot of there's a genuine need right now to focus on problems relating to systemic and structural overcapacities in key sectors, whether traditional sectors or the green tech sectors. This is where we are right now putting a lot of emphasis, and there's a lot to do there, even at the basic level of having a collective understanding of the scale of these problems, monitoring problems of structural distortions and generations over capacities, by which I mean non-market overcapacities and excess capacities. That is a necessary step. Coordinating instruments sometimes proves more difficult because obviously different instruments in different policy areas are governed by, certainly in our case, by legal statutes that are EU-based, that provide a set of protections, guardrails, checks and balances, but it also means that they operate on the basis of the integrity of the legal framework itself. So coordination sometimes there of action is more difficult, but there's a lot to be done in any case in terms of the basic understanding of the challenges and the need to de-risk, I think.
Well, thank you very very much, Denny. You've been very generous with your time. I know you've been on the line for a while now, including before you started. So thank you very much again, and we look forward, certainly I know the Australian government and George look very much forward in staying in touch and working with you on some of these issues. Cheers. Thank you.
We do also. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've gone a little bit over time, so I'll be very brief. Just to quickly capture a couple of things from today. I think as Professor Yu said, we are dealing with a pretty elastic concept with economic security, and we'll just got to live with that for a while. But there's a fair bit of learning by doing, I think, as we saw from a number of presentations today from the policy practitioners, which have really given us a rich level of detail, as well as that principle-based approach that in various ways Secretary Kennedy and Mathias Cormann talked to. We've heard about the 3 Ps, promote, protect, partnership, whether that, Helen, becomes an architecture for Australia and its economic security strategy, we'll see. We've had debates around design and efficiency, recognising, particularly from our business voices, that this has to work for business at the same time. There's an old saying that if business isn't at the table, it'll be on the menu. So in that context, I want to again particularly thank our major partners, the Minerals Council of Australia, the Asian Natural Gas and Energy Association and Microsoft for putting faith in this conference, frankly, because it was always going to be a little bit edgy in terms of its content, dealing with the world of strategic competition. So we very much appreciate your faith in us as the US Studies Centre and your generosity of your support. And I guess the final message was about our friend, the rules-based system, and as Mathias said, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there's a fair bit of baby that we need to coddle still in terms of the rules-based order if we're going to make economic security work for everyone. With that, I'll close today's proceedings. We're open for business again in the grand ballroom on the lower ground floor for dinner, anytime from 6:30 p.m. We look forward to seeing you for dinner, where we'll have, again, senior Australian government representation from Andrew Shearer, the Director General of the Office of National Intelligence, Megan Quinn, the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, and David Fredericks, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. I think I got that right. Thank you very much for your attendance today.